The second major critique of neoclassical economics, after the period in which it was most powerful in the 1980s through to the early 21st century, was from economic collapse. The system, as it was designed under neoclassical economics, collapsed in the early 21st century. People noticed that. Right. So they started critiquing this idea of neoclassical economics and the associated idea of neoliberalism along with it. And that's what we're going to look at here in Module 3, Part 2, Neoclassical Collapse. So first we have to understand how the world went from Keynesian to neoliberalism. First of all, Keynesianism became prominent. And to remember, Keynesianism is that form of economics that assumes markets fail and governments have to correct for those failing markets. As it became prominent, especially after the Second World War, governments relied on increased control to correct for market failures. Remember the guy Friedrich von Hayek, who had the Mount Pelerin Society meetings in Austria, and he invited, of course, Milton Friedman from the University of Economics. He had a plan, right? And his plan was to find funding from wealthy business owners to fund academic research in economics. And the point of that research would be to find a particular conclusion they were looking for. They were trying to find proof and make theoretical arguments, especially that neoclassical economics and free markets were the proper right way to build economic systems. So, all of these university programs, from the Chicago School of Economics to multiple around the world, were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Center for Socioeconomic Studies, numerous sort of what we would call right-wing nowadays think tanks and consortiums of large business interests. And a crisis in Keynesianism did occur in the 1970s because of OPEC oil shocks. What happened is all of a sudden oil-producing countries of the world colluded and created OPEC, and they specifically wanted to push the price of oil up higher and higher. Since the entire post-war economy was built on oil, that made massive inflation occur. This was a crisis, and in this crisis, neoliberalism took its chance to come to the fore and trying to capture the policy ideas of government. So, these wealthy neoliberal interests, through their financial support, behind conservative and right-wing party candidates at the time. So you're talking Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Brian Mulroney, people like this. And what they did is they forced neoclassical, neoliberal reforms through governments. So all over the world, governments were selling government enterprises, busting up unions, removing tariffs, and signing free trade agreements to make this sort of globalist world, as we would say, a world based on globalization. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank were transformed to just be mechanisms that enforced free trade and neoliberal free market mechanisms on all of the countries in the world. Of course, this was very strongly opposed aggressively by many of what we would call left-wing parties, advocates for the poor, environmentalists, unions, and things like that. There were many protests against these neoliberal reforms being brought in by the conservative and Republican parties. But in the 1980s, they were successful, and they really managed to significantly and almost completely redesign the world global economic order into a neoclassical / neoliberal form of free markets around the world. And because of that, we entered the stage in human history we often associate with the globalization. How did it work? We're skipping over a lot of history here, but we'll go to the important stuff. Wealthy people did extremely well. right? The wealthy billionaires and millionaires of the world did, under neoclassical economics and neoliberal globalization, become richer and richer and richer. But the average person stagnated. Countries with activist governments that actually didn't follow the neoliberal plan, they actually took advantage of the ones who did, and they did very well. So you have Japan, South Korea, and China. They were outside of this system of neoliberalism a little bit, and they had active governments that invested in their own industry, tried to build, car factories in their own countries and things like that, spent a lot, and had sort of big government that intervened in the markets. They actually managed to do very well. But the bulk of the sort of the world economy didn't do so well. You can see this in a couple of graphs have here, a couple of examples. This is US and UK unemployment, and I've just got it mapped out here from 1990 to sorry, that should be 1890 to 1990. There's a little typo in this I didn't realize. But in 1890, this is unemployment levels. Let's just look at, I guess, U.S. unemployment. That's the light gray line. You can really see U.S. unemployment is pretty high on average. It goes up and down, but it's quite high in the early 20th century up until the wars, the end of the Second World War, around 1940. It gets really, really high unemployment. After that, the Keynesian revolution comes. Remember, this period from 1890 to 1940 was a time of really classical liberal markets, free markets designed according to classical liberal doctrine. That was undermined by the catastrophic crashes that we saw in the economy. And after that, Keynesianism took over, and Keynesianism said markets fail, governments must correct for market failures. The unemployment rate then dropped. That's a good thing, right? Very few people were unemployed. The economies of the world tended to grow very fast in this period. Even the period from 1940 to 1975 was called the golden age of capitalism for that reason. So you had good economic growth and very low unemployment. But then, as you can see, when the neoliberal reforms were imposed around 1980, all of a sudden up go your unemployment measures once again. So that's not a very good sign of how well neoliberal globalization did. Another way of looking at this is that the incomes of average people stagnated under neoliberalism. Here's a graph from 1985 to 2015. And you can see here the real median income. That's the sort of reddish orange brown line here. It really doesn't go up very much. There's a famous saying that, the middle class hasn't gotten a raise since the 1960s, and it kind of holds true, especially in the United States. In this period, the middle class income didn't really go up. The poverty rate did go up in the neoliberal era. But what also went up is, look at this, GDP did go up. It did go up. But incomes didn't go up with it. What does that mean? Who captured that increase in GDP that occurred in that period? It was already the people who were the most wealthy in society. So you get a story of rich getting very rich and the poor staying the same during the neoliberal period of globalization. So neoliberalism also hit a wall right here where this gray line is in that graph. That's 2008. That's the financial crisis of 2008. And it's hard to conceive of how huge that crisis was. That's the thing that brought down neoclassical economics. Neoliberalism hit a wall, and the markets collapsed, and governments had to come in with massive bailouts to save capitalism at that time. And I don't think many people really understand what happened. Why did this happen? Various different reasons. But the basic underlying one is the economic theory on which neoliberalism was based was flawed. And designing an economic system based on neoclassical economics made a very shaky economic system that wasn't very stable for very long. Inequality, as I've already mentioned, became amplified in the neoliberal period. And it turns out one of the reasons that this thing collapsed is that inequality itself was inefficient. Remember the neoclassical economic argument that economics is only concerned with efficiency, not equality. And it's concerned with maximizing growth through efficiency. Inequality is not something that economics looks at, right? They're looking at Pareto efficiency. But it turned out that we found out with studies later that inequality itself is inefficient. So if you have inequality in society, your neoclassical economy will not work at full efficiency, at Pareto optimality. It can't happen. And we have many, many studies finding out. I've got two sort of highlighted here. The first one is from the Organization of Advanced Economies in the World, the OECD. It's called Social Employment and Migration Working Paper, and it's working paper number 163. Very exciting title, I know. But what do they find with their analysis over many economies in the world over 30 years? It says here, drawing on harmonized data covering the OECD countries over the past 30 years, the econometric analysis suggests that income inequality has a negative and statistically significant impact on subsequent growth. So inequality slows down economic growth. Here's another one from the Journal of Economic Growth. In high-income countries, inequality has a significant negative effect on transitional growth. For the medium country in the world, in 2015, that was a country with about 10,000 US dollars per capita income. The model estimates that a 1 percentage point increase in Gini coefficient, that's the measure of inequality, how economists measure inequality, the Gini coefficient. That means a 1 percentage point increase in inequality decreases GDP per capita growth over a 5-year period by over 1 percentage point. And in the long run, it's around 5% decrease in GDP per capita. So inequality is inefficient in itself, and it harms, therefore, economic growth. That pulls the rug completely out from under the neoclassical argument that inequality doesn't matter. So, how does inequality impact economic growth? Well, there's a lot of different ways. Here's some more common ones I've got here on the slide. Inequality means lower investment in health and education of the general population. Healthier and more educated populations are more efficient and have more economic growth. They work harder, they have better ideas, that sort of thing. Less access to capital for investment by small businesses. If you have an unequal world which has a lot of large companies, it's really hard for small businesses to even get loans, even if they're the greatest small business in the world. They just languish, so they don't have investment opportunities for small business. In an unequal world, social and political instability threatens markets. The sustainability of markets and the stability of markets. Investors don't want to invest in an uncertain world. And the economic system itself becomes unstable because of things like bubbles, asset bubbles, and it's sort of weird allocations of assets in a economic system with a high level of inequality. So for all those reasons, inequality became inefficient, and that brought down the neoliberal system. I already did that slide. So what happened? Government had to come in and literally rescue capitalism after 2008. Here's a picture of the crash. I just have this so you can get the idea of the crash. This is 2017 to 2020 GDP data for the United States. And you can see how it goes up, 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 and there's your crash. And you can see how massive that crash is. Then it starts to emerge again. The trick to understanding this graph, when GDP started to increase again, it did it because of massive government spending, not private capital. An unprecedented level of government spending pushed the economy to go back and start growing again instead of continuing to collapse to, well, people were saying it was the end of, civilization at that point. To put in perspective the amount of economic support for capitalism that occurred at that time, you can look at these other two graphs I have here. Let's look at the one in the bottom here. This is the size of the bailout, this big circle here. To put it in perspective, here are other past great expenditures of the U.S. government. The Marshall Plan. That's the entire plan that rebuilt all of Europe after the Second World War. All of these numbers are adjusted to adjust for the value of the dollar and for inflation, so they can be measured, compared equally. The Marshall Plan is this tiny little sliver compared to the size of the bailout of capitalism that happened in 2008 in the United States in this example, but it happened all over the world. The Louisiana Purchase, when they bought the state of Louisiana to create the United States of America, cost this dark green wedge. Nothing compared to the size of the economic bailout. The Korean War is another example. That's the middle blue here. That's how much the entire Korean War cost. Nothing compared to the expenditure required to save capitalism. Same with the Vietnam War, the entire NASA budget. The New Deal, which is the dark blue, that is Keynesian economics. That's how much all of that Keynesian New Deal cost to implement. Remember, government had a lot of programs because of market failures in Keynesian economics. This dark blue wedge is all of that post-war period Keynesian economics based on welfare that the neoliberal and neoclassical economists said was too expensive and too much government control and too much government debt required to maintain a Keynesian economy. Well, look at what it took to bail out the neoclassical economy, a huge portion. This other picture here is just another way of showing that kind of huge expenditure made. This is in all advanced economies, and you can see 2007, here's the crisis, boom, public expenditure, government expenditure increases massively. You can see it in this public expenditure graph here. Private expenditure did not. It stayed the same, right? And this is private expenditure didn't stay the same. So it wasn't private companies that bailed out capitalism. It was us. When I say public expenditure, when I say government, I mean all of us with our taxes. So it was a massive fail for neoliberalism and a massive bailout of capitalism. To learn more of the details on this, you'll have to watch these two videos and read this one reading. The first video is from Ha-Joon Chang of Cambridge University. The second from Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel laureate, on how the financial crisis was a market failure. And the third is by Sitaraman from the New Republic.